Craigslist isn't as popular as it used to be. These days, people would rather use Facebook Marketplace, and from what I've seen, that looks like a good thing. With everything being on Facebook, you're able to know the person better, and if things go wrong, the wrongdoer can easily be held accountable. Although I wouldn't know from personal experiences, I've never used this service anyway. But years ago, I was an active seller on Craigslist, but then something happened that made me swear off in-person meetings with people from the internet for good. I was 29 years old when this happened, and for the last couple of years, I've been using this site to sell off all the antiques and knickknacks I've been collecting since college. I formed a weird obsession with old-fashioned things when I quit drinking and partying with my sorority all the time, but the clutter was starting to become its own problem, so I had to get rid of it. I lived alone but in a close-knit condo community, so I never felt unsafe, even when internet strangers came by to take stuff out of my home. However, this stopped being the case one day when I thought I was finally going to sell the biggest and most expensive thing I owned, this ornate solid wood dresser that weighed a ton. It was a beautiful piece, but it had taken 2 burly mover men to get it inside, so I knew it would take that sort of manpower to get it out. I talked to one of the guys over the phone, and he said he would be bringing his friend who had a van that was large enough to fit the dresser in. I said that was fine, and they agreed to get there around 3 p.m. But then 3 o'clock rolled on, and then it was 3:30, then 4 o'clock, and when I tried calling them for the first time, they didn't answer, and that went on and on. The minutes and hours ticked away until it was almost 8. It was past dark by then, and I'd pretty much given up on them, but then they'd finally knocked on the door. I answered with a bit of an attitude, understandably, but they apologized profusely and made a bunch of excuses about how they had to use the van for work or something, and they cried that they didn't get out of work until 7. But then I stopped them mid-sentence, and I said that it was fine as long as he got the dresser out. They looked like contractors, so I wasn't sure what they wanted with a fancy dresser, but I figured they planned to flip it to a boutique store and repeat the antique lifestyle or something. I invited them inside and showed them to my room where the dresser was. They gave it a slight lift to see how heavy it really was, and they both took a step back in surprise, like they severely underestimated it or something. That's when one of them admitted that he had to quickly use the bathroom before he lifted something that heavy. I sighed and rolled my eyes a bit, but I graciously showed him to the bathroom. I walked him down the hall to the door and I opened it for him, but he didn't walk in. He didn't even hesitate, he just suddenly grabbed me and dragged me into the bathroom. I managed to let out a small scream before he threw me on the floor, where I hit my head against the tub. As I looked up, I saw that the other man was walking in behind him, and now they were both standing over me. I was dazed and confused, and even though I could see, I couldn't coordinate myself to fight or run. I was terrified. It seemed like life as I knew it was about to be completely destroyed. I can still remember the whole body sensation of dread, just wishing I could die instead of going through what was about to happen. They dug their hands through my pockets and took everything out, then grabbed my wrists and ankles to tie them together with zip ties, before finally putting a strip of duct tape over my mouth. This is it, I thought. Then, just when it seemed like the worst was about to happen, they both left and shut the door. I was so confused but also more worried than anything that they would come back to throw me in the van, but they never did. I literally spent 3 or 4 hours in the bathroom, immobilized and bleeding from the head, slowly shaking off the head trauma until I was finally able to use my tongue to get the duct tape off just enough that I could start screaming for help through it. At last, one of my neighbors heard me through the walls and called the cops. What they found, aside from me in the bathroom, was my entire condo ransacked for every valuable thing in my possession that those men were able to carry off into their van, excluding the giant dresser, of course. According to the security camera at the front entrance, the van was completely unmarked, without even a license plate, and since there was no footage of the men themselves, I was told from the get-go that the police would probably never find them. And of course they never did. It's been over 10 years since that night, and I've lived with the trauma ever since. I wonder if the fact that all they did was take everything I own is something I should be grateful for somehow, because let's be honest, they could have done much worse, and I'm just glad they didn't. I guess nobody can really predict the minds of criminal lowlifes. I remember the weirdest thing that happened to me from using Craigslist. I just moved out and I was living in a house off campus with 3 other roommates from the small college I was going to. It was a cramped living situation, but it was actually really fun. The other guys were super cool, and they'd been there for a year already, so the living room was decked out with a bunch of awesome stuff. It might sound funny, but I felt a little outdone when I compared my bedroom to the other guys. It's not like I'm super into interior design, but as a freshman in college, I felt like I needed to consider what would happen if I brought a girl into my room, and his was dry as hell with little else but a mattress and a desk. I didn't want to embarrass myself by seeming like I didn't have any interest, so I knew I had to get some cool stuff like my roommates. Some of them were musicians, so they had guitars and band posters and cool art on their walls. I wanted to go for something like that, but I didn't know how to play, so I had to look into other things to avoid looking like a poser. I started using Craigslist, and I had great luck with it at first. I managed to pick up a few things that made my room feel more homey, but it was still missing something, and that's when I saw it. An old lady was basically giving away her entire record collection, good records too, tons of original classics. I didn't even have a record player, but I hopped on it straight away. I can get a player later, I thought, but the steal won't last, so I reached out, and I ended up in contact with her son who made the post. The very same day that I saw the sale, I was driving out to go pick it up. They lived on the far outskirts of town, and when I arrived, I saw a gravel driveway leading to a front yard full of junk and a double-wide trailer in the back of the lot. I was a little put off, but I wasn't about to let that deter me. I parked out front and knocked on the door, where a few seconds later, I was greeted by the son. He was wearing the outfit of a textbook hillbilly, and from the structure of his face and the sound of his voice, I could tell that his family had probably been doing a little inbreeding in the area for many generations. But again, I guess that wasn't a problem for me. We talked outside for a minute before he invited me in. I expected the place to be a smelly mess based on the outside, and I was right, but I kept my eyes from prying. He led me to the living room where his mother was sitting in her chair, a rocking recliner that was covered in tons of blankets. It was definitely her chair that she sat in a lot. I sat on the sofa across from her as her son posted up in the doorway, leaning against the frame. The old lady started to ask me why I wanted the records, and I admitted that I didn't know too much about them, but that I was looking to get into it as a hobby. Then she asked if I had any questions, and I couldn't help but ask why she was selling her collection at such a low price. That's when things became disturbing. The old lady paused and looked at her son with a creepy smile. Then she looked back at me and said she had to admit that she hadn't been totally honest with me. She was willing to sell me the records, she said, but there was an additional cost that hadn't been mentioned. I asked her what she meant by this, and she looked back at her son. A chill ran down my spine, and I looked over my shoulder at the man, noticing now that he was eyeing me like a piece of meat. What's worse, he was blocking the only way out of the living room. I instinctively rose to my feet and backed away, right as he tried to grab me and sit me back down. The old lady kept talking in the background like she was trying to convince me to go with this. He gets so lonely, she said, and he does everything for me. This is all he ever talks about wanting, so I have to repay him for everything he's done. I started yelling at them and calling them both crazy, but the old lady's son was still approaching me. He was taller than me, bigger than me, and with that inbred strength, I didn't think I had any way of winning against him in a fair fight. My only potential advantage was that he looked pretty slow, but you know what? I'm not naive enough to go into that fight with fairness in mind. I didn't go to a stranger's house completely unprepared, and it's probably the weakest offense ever, but every time I went to pick something up off of Craigslist, I heard my older brother's voice telling me to just take a pocket knife if nothing else, so I always did. The inbred creep was about to turn me into a dungeon slave, and was already just a few feet away from me. I didn't bother pulling out the knife and telling him to back off. I knew if I did that, he would just rip it out of my hands. I had to take him by surprise. So, I flicked out the blade, and immediately I plunged it into his side. I hit him in the side of his ribs, which made my hand slip, and I sliced my finger open on the blade, but I managed to get the blade about 2 inches deep right into his lung. At the end of my attack, I pushed him away as well. He was stunned, and honestly, so was I. I remember the look on his face, like he was about to cry or go berserk, but I didn't stick around too long to find out. I left a knife sticking out of his chest and slipped through the momentary window and sprinted past him, not looking back until I got into my car and locked the doors. I didn't care about not getting the records anymore. They were worth a lot, but what they wanted was a price I wasn't willing to pay for. I took a break from Craigslist after that, and I've never been back to it since. The silver lining to this story is that I've had good luck with showing off my scar on my finger and telling the whole story of how I got it. I use a lot of sites like Craigslist for the same reasons everyone else does. You can find expensive things for really discounted prices, or even just cheap things for even cheaper. I don't have a ton of money, and using these sites are sometimes essential when it comes to getting things like furniture that's usually really expensive to buy anywhere else. This happened when I was looking around for a dining room table. Ours was really old, and my whole family used it as a place to eat and as a workspace, so it's been through a lot over the years. I went around on Facebook Marketplace and OfferUp, but neither had anything good. Most of them were still expensive, and even when I tried to bargain with a few of the sellers, none of them would budge. So then I went to Craigslist. Around here, I think most people use other sites nowadays, but Craigslist still always had the cheapest deals, though they were still somewhat rare to find. But almost as soon as I opened up the site and hit enter on the search bar, a really good listing showed up. It was a very basic wooden dining table that didn't have much wear on it, and the seller posted it for only $100 compared to the $400 to $500 everyone else was listing things for. This was a steal. I sent a message saying I'd love to check it out and would be willing to pay the full price. He didn't reply immediately, so I just took a break and hung out with my kids until around 7 o'clock when they went to their rooms to get ready for bed. I went back to my laptop and found a response from just a couple of minutes ago. It was a very quick few sentences saying he was sorry, but the table was going to be thrown out tomorrow morning. But if I really wanted it, I'd have to come by tonight or any time before 5 o'clock a.m. tomorrow. It was weird that he'd be willing to sell it at any time during the night, and his reasoning didn't make all that much sense to me. But after some thought, I replied back saying I could pick it up right now. I didn't want to go there really late into the night or super early in the morning, but it was only 7 o'clock, so I didn't see a problem if I was able to go right now. The man replied quickly, agreeing and sending the address. It was only 10 minutes from my place, so I let my wife know what was going on and where I'd be, then headed out. From context clues, you probably already know that I don't live in a lavish area. So when I say the seller's house was really worn down, I mean it was really worn down. It was small like the others in our area, but the yard was full of trash and random other things, surrounded by a thin chain link fence. I parked on the side and opened the fence, walking through the yard and up to the door, which was already open. I could hear some people talking and laughing. I peeked inside and gave a light knock on the door. Right away, a man came around the corner and invited me in. He looked like he was in late college, somewhere in his mid-20s. As I stepped inside, though, I couldn't help but notice how disgusting the whole place was. There were beer cans laying around and stains on the carpet. It looked like a really poorly taken care of house where they had probably hosted hundreds of college parties. The man was very laid back though, casually walking me down the hallway and into the kitchen while talking about how he didn't have room for the table anymore. When we got to the kitchen, there were two other men looking about the same age and standing against the wall, seemingly in the middle of a conversation. Next to them was the table. Somehow, it looked almost untouched. I didn't know how that was possible considering the rest of the house. I walked around it and checked to see if it was stable and whatnot, but as I did, the house suddenly went quiet. The two talking had stopped, and the man selling the table didn't speak either. I looked up, seeing them all staring at me. Did I do something? I asked, looking around at each of them. When my eyes fell on one of the men closest to me, though, I noticed that his pupils were massive, something that only being drugged up could achieve. But what he was on, I didn't know. Regardless, in that moment, I knew this wasn't right. Not only was this getting strange, but I didn't want to buy a table that's been in this kind of house and used by these sorts of people. I think I'm going to pass on it. Thank you though, I said softly. I started walking toward the hallway, but one of them stepped in front of me. He didn't say anything, he just stood there, blocking the way out. Something about the way they were all looking and acting, I could tell that whatever this was, it was planned out, and they likely never meant to sell the table. My face fell with fear as the anticipation of just standing there surrounded by these strangers began to overwhelm me. But then one of them stepped over and whispered something in the other's ear, and they moved aside, still not saying anything. I cautiously walked between them, hurrying down the hallway and out the door. A lot of things went through my head on the drive home. I knew that they were planning something horrible, but what that was and why they ended up letting me go, I'm not so sure of. When I got home, I told my wife, who convinced me to call the police and report it. But they couldn't do anything without anything having happened. So whatever those men were planning, I'll probably never know. I just hope someone else doesn't have to find out.